Welcome. My name is Brian Walsh, and on behalf of the family of Mr. John Moore Torbet, or just John, as most of you knew him, I thank you for coming to this service today. This service is to commemorate John's life and acknowledge his impact and influence on ourselves and the community in general. We're here today to acknowledge the passing of John and extend our deepest sympathy to all who mourn his death. It's appropriate at this time to read a small verse by John Adday in memory of John. Love doesn't end with dying or leave with the last breath. For someone you've loved deeply, love doesn't end with death. As the preceding poem says, your love for John does not need to end with his death. I would ask you to remember him. Cherish your memories of John. Tears of joy will come, as well as tears of sadness. We can only begin to move on when we understand that grief is the price we pay for the ability to love. For grief and love are two emotions that are absolutely inseparable. They are like the two sides of the same coin. Grief does not exist except where there has been love. We do not grieve for anyone we have not loved, and it might not be quite as obvious. But similarly, love does not exist, except that in loving, we undertake to pay for all the joys and privileges of love in the experience of grief and parting. None of us can know when that's going to be. For some it is sooner, for some it is later, but inevitably there is a price to pay. I think it's true that we don't get anything for nothing. Everything has its price, and grief is the price we pay for the privilege of love. The memories of John you have as a relative or a friend will always be there, and there would be no sorrow in your hearts today if yesterday you had not known the pleasure of John's presence in your life. That presence will go on, albeit only in your memories, or to express it in a different way. You can shed a tear that he is gone, or you can smile because he has lived. You can close your eyes and pray that he will come back, or you can open your eyes and see all that he has left. Your heart can be empty because you can't see him, or you can be full of the love that you shared. You can turn your back on tomorrow and live yesterday, or you can be happy for tomorrow because of yesterday. You can remember him and only that he is gone, or you can cherish his memory and let it live on. You can cry and close your mind, be empty and turn your back, or you can do what he would want. Smile, open your eyes, live, love, and go on. But I would now ask Rory to step forward and tell us more about what John's presence meant in our lives.
It's good to be merry and wise. It's good to be honest and true. It's good to support Caledonia's cause and bide by the buff and blue. Dad, and this may come as a surprise for many of you, was a very proud Scotsman. So it's only befitting that we start with a few lines from a Robbie Burns poem. There were many subjects that could result in a heated debate with Dad, ranging from the obligatory politics or religion through to social justice and the appalling overpayment of sportsmen. But the subject of Scotland was by far and away the safest if you wanted to leave without your head spinning and your ears ringing. John Archibald Moore Stark MacDonald Miller Torbet, from here on I think we'll just call him John or Dad, was born to Alan and Irene Torbet on the 4th of March 1943 in the Royal Infirmary, Perth, Scotland. Dad was the middle child of 5, having 2 older sisters, Irma and Myra, and was followed by Irene and Mark. Both Irma and Myra have also passed, leaving Irene and Mark as Dad's 2 remaining siblings. The 3 amigos are no more. At the time of Dad's birth, the Torbet family was residing in Drumcree, an estate in Stanley, a small village in Perthshire situated on the River Tay. But the fortunes of the family would change considerably due to the war and apparently some poor investments. With Dad's mum, Irene, our granny, quickly adapting from being a lady of leisure to being in service, working in estates such as Ballindine in Perthshire and eventually the Dunbar Golf Club, but we'll get to Dunbar and its significance a bit later. Despite these hard times, Dad would often recollect these years with fondness. Simple meals. Apparently cabbage was the main ingredient for all. Running through the Ballindine grounds with Kimmy the Spaniel, making model planes with his brother Mark, and of course this was where Dad obtained his work ethic, as all the children had to chip in and contribute by working on weekends and holidays. 1/3 for schooling, 1/3 for the family, 1/3 for themselves was the mantra that he constantly reminded us of. As the son of a band leader, as his father was pre-war, and a mother who was from a privileged background, music was also a fondly remembered family pastime. Having heard Dad sing on the rare occasion he went to church, and more recently reviewing his Perth Academy report cards, I can assure you that he was not one of the gifted. That said, he was also extremely proud of having attended Perth Academy from 1956 through to 1960. Back in the day, it was still a select entry school. But it was then in 1960-61 that the Torbet family moved to Dunbar, a seaside town some 30 miles south of Edinburgh. It was there that Dad met Heather, the love of his life. He also joined the Dunbar Rugby Club, eventually achieving co-captaincy, something that he was also very proud of. As the story goes, and doing some relatively simple mental arithmetic, Mum and Dad's courtship began in 1962. Mum was 14, Dad was 18. Apparently Dunbar and Alabama were the only places in the world where such relationships were allowed. We've been regaled with many an anecdote about these times involving canoodling in bunkers, greeting Harry and Jean Fell, his future in-laws, with a lit pipe held firmly in his jaw, and being chaperoned by Mum's elder sister, Sian, and her future betrothed, George Henderson, who was a member of Scotland's finest. The 4 years of courtship were apparently good times, and of course this led Dad to the Kirk on the 23rd of March 1966. On this day, John married Heather Frances Fell with a service held at the Dunbar Parish Church. Apparently, one of the many courtship conversations Dad declared was his ideal brood was 4 boys. And the following year, on the 30th of May, I was born. Over the next 5 years, with military-style precision, that dream was brought to fruition. Following my birth, Kevin Clark was born on the 16th of April 1969, Grant Ewan was born on the 23rd of March 1971, and Glenn Allen concluded the dream on the September the 2nd, 1972. In between the arrival of myself and Kevin on the 24th of July 68, Dad completed his Scottish Diploma in Agriculture at the Edinburgh and East of Scotland College of Agriculture. He then followed a 1-year post-diploma study in crop protection. Now armed with his ag qualifications, he must have realised that Scotland was way too small for a man with his ambition. So in late 1969, Dad and Mum packed up their relatively few possessions, few suitcases and their 2 boys, which they had at the time, and headed off to the mysterious and enticing Antipodes. Of course, this was during one of the many Suez Canal closures, so jumping onto an Italian ship with no stabilisers, coincidentally it was its last voyage, and to go the long way round may not quite have been the idyllic cruise that many of you might be imagining. Arriving in early 1970, porting in Brisbane, in what must have undoubtedly been a humid and hot sultry summer, leaving behind only 6 weeks earlier its typical Scottish winter, you can imagine the shock for these experienced world travellers. But waiting in Brisbane, though, were the Lorimers, close friends also from East Lothian. So comfort in numbers must surely have provided solace to this bunch of young, pale and strange-speaking immigrants. I'll quickly digress, as I do think it's relevant to the next part of Dad's story. Dad's mum, Irene, our granny, was said to possess many gypsy-like qualities. She had a cheeky smile and a twinkle in her eye, and was often seen with a lit cigarette in one hand and somebody else's palm in her other as she read it, and tea leaves were also a speciality. And olive skin, which I've obviously clearly missed, was also common in this branch of the Torbet tree. Anyway, whether it's myth or fact, the desire to put down roots was also missing for a while. As the Torbet 4 quickly grew to 6, Dad moved his family from Brisbane to Hervey Bay to Dubbo to Fairfield in Sydney, then to Hobartville across from the Ag College in Richmond, and finally to Wilberforce, about 8 kilometres outside of Windsor. So, back to the traveller myth again. Just to save up for a deposit, Dad also bought a caravan which we lived in for a while. But in this case it was a Millard, not a horse-drawn, ornately carved wooden one. During this time, as the Torbet family moved around, Mum had been hit with some significant health issues resulting in multiple hospitalisations and serious operations. So it was therefore, I think for Dad, with some considerable reluctance that he packed up his family and exited 1970s Australia to move back to the UK to be closer to our family. We arrived in a cold and wintry Dunbar in March 1977. Apparently 3 million people were living in poverty at the UK at this time. The world was about to run out of oil, and as a young schoolboy from back in Australia who used to wear shorts to school, it was a culture shock to say the least. We were, however, closer to family, and so began the annual tradition, of spending our summer holidays at Uncle Ernie and Auntie Irene's farm, White Mire. White Mire was a haunt from Dad's past and a spot that forever held a special place in his heart and mind. We were also at White Mire in the summer of 1980 when we got that fateful call that Granny Torbet, his mum, had passed away suddenly, having not long returned to Australia from a trip in the UK. I've many fond memories of these 6 years in the UK, but it was also a tough time for Dad. He initially travelled a lot when we lived in Warwickshire, and then we moved to Lincolnshire where he worked for another agricultural firm, but you could tell there was something missing. And after a lengthy time of being unemployed in 1982, we were once again heading back to the land down under. Life in Thatcher Britain was too bleak, and it wasn't just attributed to the weather. Mum was very torn to leave her family behind, but with unemployment horribly high, there was that small window of opportunity for us to relocate. Once again, out came the tea chests. I've still got no idea where he used to hide them, because they're not small. And the Torbets were on the move again. Determined not to be put off by his efforts 13 years earlier to set in Brisbane, we tried again. But this time we arrived by jumbo. Back in 1970, when we originally came over, we met an English family on the boat across, the Chambers, and we remained strong friends throughout. So surely that friendship would be tested when they offered to let the Torbet family of 6 move in with them, our 4 boys, with their 4 boys and their daughter. It was like the Brady Bunch on steroids, and it was created for a few periods, but after a few months of job hunting, when it looked like Dad might have finally achieved his ambition of settling in Brisbane, because he was offered a role with a tractor hire business, at the 11th hour, Dad was offered his dream job as sales and marketing director for Zetor, a Czechoslovakian tractor company in Port Melbourne. So Dad headed south to pave the way for our arrival, settling in and finding our new home, while the 4 boys stayed with Mum and finished off our year at the Gap. Dad had 4 memorable years with Zetor, but once again, as it happened previously in the UK, the volatility of the economic environment, and in Australia's case as well, the climate, it necessitated another move. As Dad used to say, farmers don't buy tractors in droughts. Dad, after a few months out of work, found a role with Massey Ferguson as the dealer development manager, but once again, after a few years, then this time it was the recession we had to have, according to Mr. Keating, Dad concluded his 30-year career in agriculture. He was never really happy anyway at Massey, because anybody who knows Dad would know that after being the boss, dropping down the pecking order just wasn't his thing. During his time at Zetor, though, he was exposed to the paint industry, as the Australian climate was particularly harsh on communist red paint. So, with his great mate, another fellow Scot, Andy Adams, Dad was encouraged to open a paint shop on the fringes of Dandenong with his sons, Kevin and Grant. Alas, despite growing to 2 stores and then relocating to the more affluent area of Ashburton, the creation and growth of Bunnings was to pose too many obstacles for a small independent, who in the end, when it was just Dad and Grant, the requirement to be open 7 days a week was just too challenging. But they gave it a good crack. But it was now finally time for the old fella to retire. And this is the moment to remember the man. And to do this, we also need to acknowledge his demons, because none of us are perfect. Idle hands make the devil's work, as they say, and Dad just couldn't seem to grasp the opportunities that retirement afforded. It was a shame, really, because it was about this time that the grandchildren started to arrive, starting with Lachlan, Grant's eldest. 3 years later, and to within the day, Kiara arrived, who's my eldest, and yes, I'd finally broken the Torbet curse and brought a woman into the family. Kiara's birth was shortly followed 3 months later with Connor, and then came Liam, Gemma, Mia, and last but not least, Lily. Not long after Kiara was born, Mum and Dad separated as the strains of Dad's demons and his feelings of not having achieved in his life and career what he wanted finally became too much. But as a family, however, we still gathered for birthdays, Christmases, and we even holidayed together, both in Australia and overseas. I still don't know what I was thinking, though, that time when I arranged that Noosa holiday, where 4 sets of parents-in-laws, to be honest, at the end of it, you'd rather take 35-year-olds. But it was some 12 years ago now, when traditionally we used to head off to the coast for the Melbourne Cup weekends, that I decided to encourage the family to head north for better weather. 300 days of sunshine every year, apparently. And that's when we discovered Cobram. And 3 years later, Dad made the move. He'd finally had enough of being tooted at by young female pea-paters at the traffic lights, and anybody that knows old Matilda, gear changes aren't that quick. God knows I'm no the thing I should be, nor am I ever the thing I could be. And yes, another line from Robbie Burns. But I thought it would be apt to use for my conclusion on speaking to the life that was John Torbet, father, husband, brother, son, friend, and occasionally lost soul. None of us are perfect, and learning from our mistakes is easier to say than do. But if we don't learn, are we not disrespecting the legacy and the opportunity that we've been given? We knew his flaws, as he too knew his flaws, but that doesn't change how we feel about him and how we'll remember him. Just because Dad didn't live his life the way that we would doesn't mean that it was wasted. There was many a time I'd get angry when he was sitting there with a glass of wine and book, when this once passionate man loved golf and fishing. 2 of the sports that he taught us as boys. I mean, he was surrounded by the Great Murray after all. And it's surreal to think that in 2018, when he was first diagnosed with cancer, from which he did recover, that we find ourselves standing here today. But let us remember the man who made us laugh, who challenged us, who loved us, and occasionally embarrassed us. The man who taught us discipline. Remember cleaning our shoes every night without fail after dinner. The man who taught us English when probably cleaning our shoes. He'd ask us about our days at school and use words like governance. And as 6-year-old boys, you'd ask, "What does that mean, Dad?" And he'd reply, "You know, son, bureaucracy, dominion, patronage." And we'd nod as if we understood, because we knew that to ask another question, he'd give us another 9 words from the very same thesaurus. He's the man who introduced us to aeromodelling, golf, fishing, and the corries. I still love one of those to this day. He could be verbose in his instruction, but the joy when we finally got to hold a fishing rod or swing the club. He was well read, and even to the end, he kept himself up to date with the news of the world. He made certain that you wouldn't get away with an off-the-cuff comment about a particular change in economic or environmental policy without substance and research. Would he, David? He had a passion for social justice and our treatment of the environment. I think the only ever time he voted non-Labor was for Maggie Thatcher, and we all know how that one ended. But he was a proud man. But I think that loneliness and then cancer made a dent in his standards. But that said, it still gives me joy when I think of the look on Grant's face when they were working together in the shop, and he decided that he had to tuck his shirt in just as a customer arrived. And of course, that involves undoing your belt, your fly, and dropping your trousers to your knees. But he was also a very strict disciplinarian, which in some ways made it easier because we knew exactly what you could and couldn't get away with. Imagine my surprise as a 10-year-old when I was getting too old for a smack and he told me the next time I'd get the belt. I got no idea why I nodded, because I wasn't a smart aleck, but I'll never call his bluff again. Without Dad, Papa, there wouldn't be the 7 grandchildren who at such a young age have it all in front of them. So think fondly of Papa Know that he loved us all and learn from his legacy, because life is not eternal and it should be savoured and enjoyed. You did a lot in your 79 years, Dad. You achieved more than most. And yet even to the end, there was something missing for you. But we pray that you're now at peace and know that I'll still chat to you, ask for advice, and think of all the good times. It's the only past I intend to dwell on, because the future's still so bright for the rest of us. So I hope we all do the same. Love you, Dad.
Thank you, Rory. We've now got some words from the grandchildren, read by Connor Torbet. So Connor could step up.
Papa was a man who was proud of his heritage and loved to share his wisdom and experience with those around him. When I was younger, I remember Papa sharing stories of him as a young man back in Scotland. And I feel that he had many, many more stories to share. Us cousins feel it a great loss that Papa is gone, but we are grateful to have shared time with him, and today we are here to celebrate his life and his memory that will live on forever throughout the future generations.
Well done, Connor. I now ask Lily to step forward to read a poem, My Heart in the Highlands.
My heart is in the highlands. Farewell to the north, the birthplace of Valier, the country of Worth. Wherever I wander, wherever I rove, the hills of the highlands forever I love. My heart is in the highlands, my heart is not here. My heart is in the highlands, a-chasing the deer, a-chasing the wild deer, a-following the roe. My heart is in the highlands, wherever I go. Farewell to the mountains high, covered with snow. Farewell to the straths and green valleys below. Farewell to the forests and wild hanging woods. Farewell to the torrents and loud pouring floods. My heart is in the highlands, my heart is not here. Oh, already read that one.
Well done, Lily. We now have some messages from friends, starting with Paul Cox.
The Torbet family have received many kind messages from all over the world and from family and friends. Time doesn't permit reading all of these messages. Suffice to say that it's clear from the sentiments expressed that John had a positive influence on many throughout his life. I will, however, read to you the key messages from John's surviving siblings in Queensland and in Perthshire, Scotland. Firstly, from his brother and family in Queensland. Unfortunately, we're unable to travel to Victoria for my brother's farewell, but we will be there in spirit at least as we remember our happy years together in Perthshire. And from all the way from Perthshire in Scotland, from John's sister Irene. It's so sad to learn that my brother John has succumbed to his illness. He fought hard for 3 years and suffered greatly. When we were youngsters in Perthshire, John, Mark and myself were known locally as the Three Amigos. We had great fun and happiness, memories I will always hold dear, and I hope John did too. Goodbye. To local friends, we have a lovely message that's come from Paul Cox, who John first employed in the ag industry many, many years ago. And Paul says this: "Firstly and foremost, John Torbet was the man who gave me my first start as a salesman after I dropped out of an engineering degree at university. I am forever grateful for this opportunity and the confidence he showed in me starting my career in sales, which led me to where I am today. His initial guidance and training showed me that to be a good salesman, you had to have confidence in your product and persistence to succeed. John allowed me the freedom and the guidance to develop my sales skills, search out sales opportunities throughout prospecting, and provided me with my first company vehicle, a Toyota light stout utility truck, later replaced by a brand new Falcon Ute, which was, and sounds like it still is, his pride and joy. Many hours were spent prospecting the many farms and businesses, often with little results, but with his constant encouragement and leadership I would persist until I got the sale. John became more of a workmate than a boss, and I remember the camaraderie he engendered in me. As a young man, I shared many great times at field days, displays, and socialising with those in the machinery game. John always looked out for me and made sure I was welcomed into the fold, as it were. The other trait that I admired in John was his neatness and presentation. His desk, his car, the branch, and his own personal presentation were always faultless. He instilled in me as a young man that the first impression is the first step to success. The first impression is the first step to success, a lesson many of us might like to think of today. And in this aspect I have always practiced throughout my working life and right through my own very successful real estate business before my retirement, these basic principles that John stood by and taught, as strong today as they were back then. I do have to add, however, that my wife Judy always had difficulty understanding John's broad Scottish accent and would often ask me to interpret. Just the other day she mentioned the times and the outings with the Torbets and babysitting the 4 little blonde boys. I have a lot to thank John for in setting me off on my very own path to success, but like a lot of blokes, we do not say it often enough. Farewell, John. I can't thank you enough for all you did for me. And finally, a message from Richard, Diane and Natasha Petrie in Randwick in New South Wales, old and dear friends. Richard's originally from Dunbar, where Heather and John lived. And they say, John Torbet had a presence. He stood tall and often had a cheeky grin on his face. There seemed to be a fine line between the serious and the funny John. I think we all can relate to that. Dinners at Paddington when John was in town working well before the family moved back to Australia were always entertaining. He was well read, erudite and a deep thinker. As he puffed on his pipe, his fierce intellect made conversations more than interesting. Common theme that's coming through today. John didn't like being away from Heather and the boys, but it was a job involving travel and it had to be that way. Memories of barbecues at Wilberforce with the boys, running around the large backyard, were fun. Heather and John were the only people from the groom's side who attended our wedding in Sydney, and we were really chuffed about that. We have lovely photos of Heather and John when they came to Diane's parents for dinner. The boys were all dressed in red jumpers, knitted by Heather, and carried little bags of goodies to keep them entertained. John grinned proudly as they marched in. Life threw many challenges at John, and in the earlier years he was able to respond, but over time they took their toll. And he was less able to deal with them, often ignoring good advice. Over time, John's abilities diminished, and a stubbornness grew, affecting his judgment in a way which had consequences for his family, who he dearly loved. It affected his responsibilities to himself and in particular his health. We will remember the good times and acknowledge the bad, and grieve for what is, and find forgiveness for saying that behaviour is okay. To Rory, Kevin, Grant and Glenn, John the thinker would like his boys to grow from adversity. Heather and David were John's best friends, and the support they gave was boundless, unconditional love. Our apologies for not being there today. We would have wanted to be. COVID strikes again. Our love and thoughts are with you all. I would like to conclude with a few words. I first met John Torbet in 1962 in Dunbar, 60 years ago. I remember the year and the meeting well, because at the time I was being taught to drive by my scouting friend George Henderson, the man destined to marry Heather's sister Shan. When we arrived at Shan's house one Saturday morning, we sprung open the door, probably in an effort to escape the Scottish summer weather, only to find John and Heather in a passionate embrace. Did they get a surprise? Little did any of us realise that 60 years later on, our lives would still be connected. It was probably one of the few surprises that John ever experienced in his life, given the apparent penchant for planning and organising referred to by Paul in his business team member. So it's no surprise that John built a career out of managing people. We're all aware, and certainly Rory has referred in his remarks, John was a proud patriot. In addition, however, the reality was that he had always been a passionate advocate for an independent Scotland, which in later years manifested itself as an unwavering, despite economic evidence to the contrary, in his determination to vote for Scotland. He was delighted when, following a visit to Scotland during the Scottish independence vote, Heather and I brought back a heap of marketing blurb and political material for him, some of which now adorns the rear window of his beloved vehicle he nicknamed Matilda. Back in the 1960s, it was customary in the UK for the national anthem, God Save the Queen, to be played at the cinema. Pretty much all of us wussies, my friend and cohort included, did what everybody expected and stood to attention. Not John Torbet. No. He was staying seated and in his way making his personal statement for an independent Scotland. Those of us who were privileged to know John well, however, also knew that, like his hero, the poet Robert Burns, John's political views were diametrically opposed to rule by the privileged, such as the British royalty and establishment. Woe betide anyone brave enough to take John on in a debate on this subject. He was well researched, passionate, and he knew his subject well. Debates could, and often did, get ugly. As Rory said, John was educated at the prestigious Perth Academy and then Dunbar Grammar School, where he met Heather. Following a successful year 12, John enrolled in college, finally graduating with a diploma in agricultural science. He possessed a sharp intellect, and one that I was certainly envious of. John was an avid reader, and this armed him with an eclectic range of knowledge. But the history and geography of Scotland, without doubt, would have been his mastermind subject. Tempting as it was, those of us who knew John well could understand we couldn't send John on the mastermind programme. We were all terrified that he would argue all the way to the end with the quizmaster. I recall that just before John's cancer diagnosis, Rory and Lucy gifted Heather and I tickets to go to a presentation in Melbourne by the well-known and erudite Scottish historian Neil Oliver. Some of you may be familiar with his TV series Coast Australia. However, the tickets, we were advised, came with conditions. We had to take John with us. This was a tough call. Do we thank Rory and his family for the generosity, but declare thanks, but no thanks? Or do we bite the bullet and just hope that John doesn't stand up and challenge Neil Oliver on some point he has made and wear the embarrassment that came with it as John went toe-to-toe with a world expert historian? In the end, we decided, what the hell, what can possibly go wrong? We picked John up at Flinders Street Station, took him out to dinner and to the show. We all had a great night. To our surprise, however, one of the night's highlights for John was revealed while we were taking the tram from the convention centre to Flinders Street Station. To the surprise of Heather and myself, John announced that this was his first ride on a Melbourne tram. Such was the life of a corporate man more used to valet parking and his company car. Socialism, it seems, had its boundaries, even for John. As John's illness progressed and his capacity to handle the day-to-day minutiae deteriorated, particularly when anything to do with government forms was involved, John relied on myself and others to assist him. On one such occasion, we were attempted to complete a typical Centrelink form, and anyone who has dealt with Centrelink can well relate to what I'm saying. John drew my attention to what he thought was the minuscule space available to handwrite his given names into, What's the problem, John? I retorted. I can get my two given names in there with space to burn. And I know I've already got these names wrong because Rory has corrected it. That might be okay for you Scottish Lowlanders, David, but my full name is John Archibald Moore Stark McAlpine blah 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 Torbet. How am I expected to fit all that in this form? He said, roaring in laughter with his own humour, arguably a characteristic of John's not often put to the test. That said, John loved to tell a joke, and he was good at it. However, this is not the time nor the place to reiterate any of John's favourite off-colour gags, perhaps much later. Be in no doubt, John loved living in Cobram. A countryman through and through. I say to those here from the village who befriended him, thank you. It may not have been obvious, but he loved you all. Many will be aware that John was fiercely proud of his ancestry, not for him the increasingly popular boast of coming from First Fleet convict stock. No way, not for John Torbet. As he once said to me, David, did I ever tell you that I'm a direct descendant of Kenneth MacAlpine, the first King of Scotland? And I have the documentation to prove it. And he was, and he has. Rory will now carry the hereditary mantle onwards. From all of us gathered here to celebrate your life, but especially on behalf of absent family and friends in far-off places, your work is done. You can now rest in peace.
Thank you. Now, if I could ask Kiara and Gemma Torbet to step forward for some more words from the grandchildren.
An honest man here lies at rest, and ever God with image blessed. The man of friend, the friend of truth, the man of age and guide of youth. See hearts like his with virtue warmed, see heads with knowledge so informed. If there's another world, he lives in bliss. If there's none, he made the best of this.
How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that he should give his only Son to make a wretch his treasure. How great the pain of searing loss, the Father turns his face away, as wounds which mar the chosen one bring many saints to glory. Behold the man upon a cross, my sin upon his shoulders. Ashamed I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished.
Now, Rory, just making sure we haven't missed anything in that program beautiful. It's not scripted here, but one of the legacies that I see that John has left is something that he's got grandchildren he could be extremely proud of, and I'm sure he was. The reading from the grandchildren and that singing was top notch, so well done. But today we lift up our hearts in gratitude for the life of John, for all the goodness bestowed upon him during his life, and for all that he was to those who loved him. May we rejoice in John's life, be thankful that his life touched on ours, surround us and all that mourn today with continuing compassion. Do not let grief be without end or overwhelm us, but rather draw us closer together in friendship and love. So today we want to be thinking not only of the darkness of death, but the splendour of life. Let us even now face life with courage and hope. Give us the grace and strength to go on knowing that the best tribute we can pay John is to let his life be a continuing inspiration to us. So John, you'll be forever in the memories of all who knew and loved you, and it is with this final goodbye to you that all of us here say, we will remember you until we meet again. So tenderly and reverently we commit our beloved John to the elements from which all life comes and which in the end all life returns. We are grateful for the life that he has lived and for all that his life has meant to us. And so we say, we are glad he lived. We are glad we saw his face, felt his touch and heard his laughter. We are comforted to know all pain has ended and his spirit is free. And now it's time to scatter John's ashes. So if you'll step forward and we'll move to the river for John's final goodbye. Would you like to step forward?